So good afternoon and welcome. I'm Andrea Bachner, the director of the East Asia program, and it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this year's distinguished Gu lecture. The lecture commemorates one of Cornell's most distinguished alumnus, the Chinese writer, statesman, and intellectual Gu. It was inaugurated on the 100th anniversary of Gu's graduation from Cornell, which was in 1914, and it marked the beginning of a series of initiatives for engagement with modern and contemporary China at Cornell. Today's lecture is sponsored by the East Asia program and made possible thanks to the generous contribution of the Department of History. In addition to Professor Koh's talk today, there will also be a workshop tomorrow in the context of the Cornell's Classical Chinese Colloquium. Even as the Gu lectures are one of the key events of Cornell's academic community engaged in research in East Asia, their resonance and importance lies well beyond that particular community. And it seems especially apt during homecoming week to call on Gu's example and seek continued inspiration there. By invoking the name of Gu, these lectures celebrate the adventure of cultural and intellectual work as such. More specifically, they recognize some of the key values of academic work as embodied at Cornell and beyond. First of all, the importance of movement and contact across different cultures. As Gu came from China to the US to further his studies at Cornell and later at Columbia, his path echoes the multicultural and multinational backgrounds of students and scholars here. By the same token, research by scholars and students at Cornell wouldn't be what it is without being informed and inspired by places beyond Ithaca and beyond the US, for instance, China. Second, the combination of theoretical knowledge, philosophical reflection, creative experimentation, and a view towards pragmatic change. Gu in his multiple roles as diplomat, poet, philosopher, cultural agitator, researcher, educator, and academic leader, models for us a scholarly ideal in which policymaking and the effecting of real-life changes are closely tied to, if not outright dependent on philosophical reflection and cultural and social analysis. And third, an attention to the past as a way of engaging with the present. Gu not only wrote what is seen by many as the first modern Chinese poem, he was also a scholar of Chinese philosophy and of what some call in English redology, right? The study of the Chinese novel, The Dream of Red Chambers or Story of the Stone. Shaping the present and the future depends on an understanding of historical context and cultural analogies. Hence, many of the Gu lectures engage explicitly in a type of scholarly work that rejects presentism, the exaggerated emphasis on the contemporary, and show instead that historical horizons matter deeply. But Gu's life is also an example of the vicissitudes of intellectual formation and work, its dependence on real-life events, as people's lives are marked by the impact of national and global conflict. Gu's studies here in the US were made possible through the Boxer Indemnity Fund, a grant scheme that was a direct consequence of the Allied intervention in China to suppress the Boxer rebellion at the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. Later in his life, upon the communist victory on the Chinese mainland, Gu relocated to Taiwan and concluded his life and career displaced and far away from home. Speaking of factors that impact intellectual and creative work, I'm particularly pleased that this year's Gu lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Dorothy Ko on the topic of gender and material culture, pivots on questions of gender. Questions of difference and diversity, such as gender and sexual orientation, and the ways in which they intersect with other categories, remain crucial to our cultural and intellectual endeavors. And in fact, as you will have seen or will see, many of the initiatives of the East Asia program this semester and this year focus on such issues. I want to believe that what Gu stands for is capacious enough to expand also to such areas of engagement and challenge. But I will stop there and hand things over to my colleague Su-Yung Son, who will introduce today's speaker.
Welcome to the annual Shi Distinguished Lecture. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Dorothy. I'm Su-Yung Son, and I'm assistant professor in Asian Studies, studying literary and the cultural history of so-called early modern China, roughly defined from the 16th to the 19th century. Because my area of research is a little bit overlapped with the historical period that Professor Dorothy is working, I can say a bit about how much significantly her works have changed the field of Chinese cultural history, gender studies, and visual and material culture. I can also share about how her intellectual trajectory informs new directions and perspectives to examine Chinese history in general, and history of Chinese women in particular. Professor Ko earned both undergraduate and PhD degrees at Stanford University, and since 2001, she has been teaching at the Barnard College of Columbia University. She is now a professor and chair of history and women's studies. Professor Ko's first book, Teachers of the Inner Chambers, Women and Culture in 17th Century China, which came out in 1994, is a groundbreaking study in the exploration of the social and emotional lives of upper-class Chinese women in early modern China. The book takes us on a journey into the inner chambers, the space in which women not only read and wrote, but also appeared as active participants in the literary scene and the elite culture of the day. In doing so, her book does not merely vividly flesh out the voices of women who have not been well recognized, but it also radically revises the prevailing assumptions of Chinese women as cloistered, crippled, and victimized, by demonstrating that this stereotype of Chinese women was far from historical reality. It was promoted by the ideological agendas of the early 20th century reformers, the Communist Party, and Western feminist scholarship. So one of the main aims of our book is to distinguish normative prescriptions of elite Confucian discourse of gender from the experienced realities of women themselves. Indeed, her book successfully portrays not only how women themselves perceived, vested, or negotiated with prescriptions for their conduct, but also how their gender awareness serves as a basis for networking and reorganizing the social community. In short, her work established itself as one of the most pioneering gendered history in a genuine sense, and raises the gender as one of the most important and useful categories of historical analysis. Professor Ko's research extends well beyond the highly educated elite women who could have their voices and traces in written form. One of the perennial problems in the study of Chinese women is lack of enough written materials. And then I think this is actually where her creativity shines. To complement the paucity of historical materials to capture women's everyday lives and emotions, she turns her focus to the everyday objects that women have used and treasured. Following the reconstruction of women's lives embedded in material artifacts, such as embroidered slippers, which came out as a book titled Every Step a Lotus, Shoes of Bound Feet in 2001, her following monograph, Cinderella's Sisters, a revisionist history of foot binding in 2005, directly tackles the practice of foot binding, which is considered to be one of the most notorious physical symbols of Chinese women's subservience to patriarchy. By searching for the explanations for the longevity of the practice and the reason why women embraced and perpetuated this seemingly torturous custom, she persuasively argues that foot binding was far from a uniform and timeless practice motivated by a single cause. Instead, it served as the locus of diverse meanings by changing economic, social, and cultural forces expressed in various local styles and rituals. shifting our focus on the perspectives of the Chinese women themselves who carried out, managed, and experienced, and explore what they made out of this practice. She argues that bookbinding is shaped in bark as intertwining inspirations that configured female as well as male subjectivities. This book won the Joint Calvin Memorial Prize of the American Historical Association for the best book in women's history and feminist history in 2015. Professor Ko's most resemble the social life of inkstones, artisans, and scholars in early Qing China, which we will hear more about today. Further advances her engagement with the material culture by following the life of the inkstone and the process of its production and consumption. By giving due weight to the artisans who made inkstones, including women artisans, rather than just the scholars who used them, she shed light on the intangible physical labor, skills, and desires of artisans, and raised the need to reconsider the relationship among gender, technology, and art in early modern China. Aside from her monographs, she co-edited 2 books, The Birth of Chinese Feminism, Essential Texts in Transnational Theory, and Women and Confucian Cultures in Pre-Modern China, Korea, and Japan. In this way, Professor Ko's wonderfully imaginative, wide-ranging, and provocative studies cut across the temporal division between the pre-modern and modern, as well as the national border between China and other East Asian countries, such as Japan and Korea. In addition, her historical research intersects anthropology, literature, and material and visual culture. The grand historical discourse tends to overlook women, artisans, everyday practices, and ordinary objects, but she brings them to the central stage of historical analysis and shows how much they enrich our understanding of historical experiences and practices. Every step of her research opens up a new level of scholarly engagement, serving as an exemplary model for us to keep questioning how we have come to know what we believe to be true about the world. I'm very proud to have her present here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dorothy.
Thank you very much for having me here. I feel that my self-image is still that of a craftswoman. So to share the same podium with the father of the Chinese Renaissance, Dr. Hu Shi, is a bit much for me. And I'm also really grateful to meet Professor May, who has been instrumental in setting up this Hu Shi Distinguished Speaker Series. And I'm really grateful to be here. I also want to thank Suyong, TJ, Amala, Joseph, and Joshua, and especially the East Asian Program, Department of History, for giving me such a warm welcome. And I'm so happy to see all the students here, because the future is yours. So, Hu Shi, as we know, is a famous Chinese thinker, intellectual, and statesman. Was one of the most famous Canadian, although I have to thank for saying that after that he came to Columbia. In this portrait that is exhibited in the newly opened Hu Shi Memorial Hall in Nangang, Taiwan, he is smiling at us at his usual desk, holding a writing brush and wearing an open collar Western-style white shirt. Hu Shi was said to love to tell his friends and students that when he wants to write poetry, he would use the Chinese writing brush, and when he wants to do other kinds of writing, presumably the more kind of analytic form of writing, he would use a fountain pen. So this is how he negotiated between East and West. However, Gu Shih was not as traditionally Chinese as his choice of a writing brush may seem, for I discovered that he drew ink from a ceramic box instead of grinding his own ink with an inkstone and inkstick. So he is very efficient. So the ink grinding stone, the subject of my talk today, seems to be so alien to 20th century writers that I would like to introduce you to him first. Chinese writers and painters prefer to grind their own ink with this inkstick on the surface of the inkstone with this lightly controlled circular motion by adding water to control the color and also the thickness of the ink. The reason why traditional writers and painters prefer to grind their own ink or have a monkey or a butler grind the ink for them fresh at the desk, it's because that way you can control the nature and the color of the ink so that you can produce 50 shades of gray if you want for your ink paintings and for your calligraphy. So it's a very laborious process, but it's important to the art. So although in theory, any stone can be made into an inkstone, Chinese artists believe that some stones are better than others. So I have in front of you, both on the screen and on the table, three famous stones or three famous quarries and the stones that made from them. I'm actually going to pass them around. They are not fragile, so just don't kill your neighbor with them. When each comes to you, so the first is a Duan stone from southern China in the province of Guangdong. It comes with a box, and you're welcome, and I'll keep the cover here so that you don't have to handle too many pieces. You are welcome to spit on it. If you have an umbrella, if there is moisture in your hair, try to do what the Chinese connoisseurs do and put a fresh coat of water on the surface of the stone, and that way you can notice the specific colors and the mineral pigments and the patterns more clearly so that you can identify them. So the first stone is from Duan, and it goes from here. The second stone, I don't have a box for, is from Shih or present-day Jiangxi. It used to be part of Anhui in Huizhou. You would notice that this is a much harder stone, and you are also welcome to spit on it, but you actually don't need to because the veins are much more visible. For both of these stones, I would welcome you to try to grind ink with it. Here's the ink stick. But there are actually four different questions I would like you to make a mental impression of. One is try to notice the color of the stone and how different they are, all three of them. The second is to notice, as I said, the pigmentation and the mineral features on the stone. The third is the shape, form, or design of the stone. And the fourth point is actually if it does have a box, what is the relationship from a design point of view, from the makings point of view, between the stone and the box? Because all three are different that way. The last stone is the most interesting, actually, from Manchuria, from Jilin, or now called Songhua stone, named after the Songhua River or the Songari River. This one is actually 3 pieces, and I would just ask you to notice that there are 3 pieces. I'm going to put them back. This is a stone that was discovered by the Qing Emperor Shih in the 17th century. Until the 17th century, no one had seen this stone and no one had used this to make inkstone. So it's kind of like the emblem of Qing material culture, actually, that was invented by the Manchus. It's also quite hard. The color is different, so I also want you to pay attention to these 4 questions. And I will give the people on the edge a chance to be first. So if you can bear with me, please keep those questions in your head. And afterwards, if there is interest and time, we can do a little kind of discussion on the connoisseurship and the history of connoisseurship of inkstones. After an hour, you all would be masters of it or mistresses. But today, I want to think about a question that actually had bothered me for a long time. I still don't have an answer. And that is, especially in modern societies like ours, we are so accustomed when we think of women's relationship with things, we are so accustomed to think of women as shoppers, as consumers. Women could be cooking dinners at home, but how many of us know women who build houses, who make furniture, or women who design cars? Why is it so difficult for us in the modern times, and actually in the pre-modern times in China? Why is it so difficult to imagine women as producers, as makers of sophisticated things that required a highly specialized level of skill and training? So the protagonist of my talk is one such woman from the 18th century, an artisan by the name of Gu Ernang, who became the most famous inkstone maker and carver of her generation. There were a handful of women before her who were celebrated embroiderers or artists, painters in Chinese history, but none has really excelled as an artisan, as a craftswoman who ran her own workshop under her own name, let alone making an object, ironically and paradoxically, that is the emblem of elite male masculinity. As we have seen, right, in our own palm, an inkstone is a palm-sized slab of stone which writers and painters use to grind ink. To those of us who upgrade our iPhones every year, how many of you? It is really difficult to convey the emotional and psychological attachment that Chinese male scholars developed with a piece of stone, and the great length they would go to procure the best one. It is as though they believe that the brilliance of their essays and the books depend on the secret knowledge about how their own laptop was made and which one is made from the highest grade aluminum from a particular bauxite quarry in, say, China, because as we know, China is today's is the largest bauxite producer in the world. So there is this kind of entanglement that the male scholars felt with the kind of material object of the practice that we simply don't share, male or female. Why is that? A good inkstone is not only a writing instrument on every scholar's desk, It is also a token of male friendship, a gift from father to son. When the son first goes to school, a father will commission an inkstone for him. It's also a collector's item that could cost a small fortune. As a functional and aesthetic object, the inkstone is entangled with the self-identities as well as the intellectual and social lives of the male scholar and male scholars alone. Although naturally women writers and painters had to use the inkstone to grind ink and write the essays and poems and execute the paintings, but it just does not have the same emotional relevance to women artists as it is for men. Why is that? It comes as no wonder that all known inkstone makers are men. To appreciate how unusual Gu Ernang's career was, we have to first revisit the normative social and gender order in Chinese society in the 18th century, in Gu Ernang's time. Women were expected to stay at home, even though, in fact, they seldom did, and take charge of a wide range of tasks, from rearing children, providing for the food and wine, to doing textile work to supplement household income, while men manage the so-called affairs on the outside or in the outer realm. Gu Ernang's achievements and fame are all the more curious when we consider that it was rare even for a male artisan to leave his name in history. Chinese scholars, like some of our male politicians today, speak very loudly, take up more than a share of airtime, and as a result, enjoy a disproportionately large dose of discursive power over other groups in society. Since scholars who, according to Mencius, labor with their minds did not hold those who labor with their bodies in high regard, they seldom mention artisans in their scholarly writings, let alone promoting the artisans' worldviews and knowledge cultures, which were so different from their own. The artisans, like farmers, are thus hidden in plain sight in Chinese history and society. We know that for sure that they exist, or the scholars would not have had food on the tables, bowls to eat the rice from, or chairs to sit on, inkstones to grind ink with. But these individuals who made the necessities of everyday life possible are erased from history. Since history is written by the scholars, it reflects the scholars' values and priorities. This is the trouble with our female artisan Gu Ernang. Although famous, there is still so much we do not know about her. We do know that for 20 years, she operated an inkstone making workshop under her name on Zhuanzhu Lane, just inside the bustling Chang Gate in Suzhou. The Zhuanzhu Lane is the neighborhood where the best carvers of jade and stones gathered in the empire. But there is no record of her years of birth and death. We do not even know Gu's name at birth, nor when did the name Gu Ernang, which is kind of her professional workshop name, became associated with her. Gu is the name of her husband's family, which had been inkstone carver for 2 generations, but we know absolutely nothing about her parents' occupation or their background. The material archive offers little help. There are many inkstones that bear her signature mark in museums and private collections today. and new ones seems to be popping up in auctions in China every day. But none, not a single one, can be authenticated to be truly from her hands. So our usual method of researching the life of a scholar, which is by considering or by compiling a year-by-year biography of the person, a nianpu, or the usual way that we construct the career of a painter, which is by constructing a catalog raisonné or an annotated catalog of his reliable works, seem to fail us when it comes to a female artisan. Nor can we adopt the productive method recently developed by material culture scholars, which is to analyze whatever textual sources we can find against the material evidence, simply because we do not know any inkstone that can be safely attributed to her. So this is the challenge for me. I'm going to pass it on to you. Instead of being deterred, I want to confront this difficulty as an opportunity to rethink the gender and class biases in our own research methods as historians. But first, I want to present what little information we do have about her so that we can all brainstorm about how best we can solve her puzzle together. And there would be a quiz for the students. We do have scattered references on Gu Ernang made by her male patrons or clients who had direct contact with her. So these are the reliable textual materials. And from these writings, we can put together a rough picture of Gu Ernang's early career and her training. The earliest textual mention of Gu Ernang was made by a Suzhou scholar by the name of Huang Zhongjian, a patron of Gu Ernang's father-in-law Delin and Ernang herself. It's kind of a long text. Let me just briefly read some of the pertinent parts. So Huang Zhongjian was very proud of the fact that Suzhou was so famous for inkstone making. So in my native town, Gu Delin was skilled in making inkstones. Although others tried to imitate him, in the end, they could not. So we see that Gu Ernang's father-in-law was beginning to become famous. Once Gu Delin made an inkstone with a knotted design for my friend, which I loved a great deal. So I therefore handed him 2 pieces of Duanstones, and you might remember what a Duanstone looked like. But when Delin executed the stones, the patron was unhappy because it was not as good as the one he made for his friend. So greed is always the first motive for collecting. Huang was about to locate a better stone and ordered Delin to remake it, but the craftsman unfortunately, inconveniently died on him. So the 2 verbs that I highlighted in red, to hand it and to order, leave no doubt in our minds that the patron client was in the commanding position in this transaction. So it showcased a kind of a class hegemony on the part of the scholar ordering the craftsperson around, even though the inkstone maker was already quite famous. So the story goes on, and intriguingly, over 10 years later, Huang Zhongjian never gave up on his dream of one-upmenting his friend. So he finally found a good piece of stone, and But by then, not only had Gu Delin died, even Delin's son Qiming, who was Gu Ernang's husband, had also passed away. But he heard that Qiming's wife has inherited the family mantle. Before I realized it, her name has grown by the day. So it's intriguingly, he waited and waited, and then he regretted, oh my gosh, she's getting more famous, she's getting more expensive. So in the autumn of the year Renchen, which is 1712, I ordered her, again that famous verb, to make the stone into whatever design shape she chose. So we know that Wang Zhongjian has no respect for craftsmen, but through this text that documents his own transaction, we learn a very interesting fact about the commissioning process, whereby it's a face-to-face negotiation, a give and take, a collaboration between the craftsman, the craftswoman, and the client, no matter how important and self-important the patron or the client happened to be. So this is very different from us walking into a department store and just buy something off the rack. And this is an important point that I'll come back to. So from this text and other textual references, we can deduce that Gu Delin, Ernang's father-in-law, died around 1692, and that his son, who was Ernang's husband, Gu Qiming, died, unfortunately, not too long after. So Gu Ernang was mostly responsible as a widow, as a filial daughter-in-law, for training their adopted son Gu Gongwang, who was later recruited into the imperial workshop in the capital and unfortunately disappeared from history as well. But the latest, by 1700, Gu Ernang had taken over the Gu workshop in Zhuanzhu Lane in Suzhou and operated as his master, mistress, however we might call it, for over 20 years, until her death sometime after 1725. In terms of the transmissions of skills, she became the third and most important and most famous generation of the Gu inkstone making family. I'm sorry to be boring you with this minutiae because it took me 10 precious years to figure this out. And there is a trick in this genealogy. So who has a good memory, please take a snapshot of this in your head. So thus far, the most interesting aspect of Gu Ernang's early career is the lack of uniformity of her name. Her patron Huang Zhongjian called her Qiming's wife. In the passage we read above, he also referred to her as wife of the Gu family, Gu Jiafu. Another Suzhou writer and contemporary of Huang Zhongjian by the name of Zhu Xiangxian diverged that Ernang's natal family name is the Zhou, and that locals call her Gu Qinliang. Later, another writer addressed her in a similar vernacular format, Gu Qinliang. A third name, Gu Ernang, which is her common professional name that we use today, had yet to appear in the early stage. So the lack of uniformity of Gu Ernang's name revealed two intriguing aspects of her early career, of a famous female artisan and her public reception in her native city. The first is that personal and face-to-face encounter is paramount to her fame. A potential client might have come into contact with her work in a friend's studio, on a friend's desk, or might have heard about how good she is by word of mouth and decided to commission her to make an inkstone for him. So this explains why her name, which later became codified in writing, are slight oral variations. It is interesting to note that by all accounts, in terms of gender relationships, by all accounts, Gu Ernang received her male patrons in her own workshop, which is actually the front of her house, and interacted directly with them. So the taboo of avoiding contact with the opposite sex that governed a gentry woman's daily life evidently did not apply to an artisan. The second intriguing aspect of Gu's early career is the range of attitudes that people exhibited toward the unusual specter of a female head of an artisanal workshop. So here, for those who have that good memory, from the perspective of family survival, for those of us who know a little bit about Chinese family structure and genealogies, we know that Gu's rise is in fact the most uncontroversial thing, and her behavior falls entirely within the ethical demands of Confucian patriarchy. In other words, as a widow, of course you learn the skills and rules of the trade from your father-in-law before inheriting the family business, which is a rather typical way for women to gain power or control without violating any of the patriarchal norms. Indeed, I suspect that there are plenty of other artisans or businesswomen in Gu's time who stepped in to do a man's job when the man could no longer do it in the absence of a son, just that none became as famous as Gu Ernang so that we could research her. Yet, the presence of a man in a nominally male-to-male transmission did pose enormous problems for some of Gu's patrons and some of the local historians at the time. The editors of an early 18th century imperially commissioned encyclopedia invented a fictive father of Ernang's father-in-law, Delin, so that the term 3 generations of Gu artisans can refer to 3 generations of men. And Ernang, the daughter-in-law, was reduced to being an unnamed placeholder in this patriarchal transmission, a male-to-male transmission, and subsequently erased from history. The reason why it took me 10 years of my precious life to figure this out is because the official local histories of Suzhou follow these invented genealogies, and everybody was wrong ever since. I actually did not figure out, I'm not the first one to have figured out that this is wrong. One of my friends in Beijing was the first one, and then all of a sudden I realized why I couldn't round the numbers. As Gu Ernang's fame spread, she gained her most loyal and important patrons in Fuzhou, in Fujian province on the southeastern coast of the empire. In an old, lovely neighborhood in Fuzhou, today called Sanfang Xixiang, 3 lanes and 7 alleys, a group of men whose family had intermarried for generations and who grew up studying the same books together, developed a shared passion for inkstones as part of their intellectual scholarship, their serious interest in epigraphy or the study of ancient scripts. At least 7 of them became lifelong patrons of Gu Ernang. They include the calligrapher and court scribe Lin Zhi, Lin Zhi's friend Yu Dian, Lin Zhi's son Lin Fuyun, and the poet Huang Ren. Although largely forgotten today, these Fuzhou scholars form the most innovative inkstone collecting and connoisseurship circle in the empire in the early Qing. Earlier, I mentioned that Chinese scholars disdained bodily labor, hence they did not hold the craftsman in high esteem. The Fuzhou circle of scholars is most unusual in that they actually took up the carving knife to carve inkstones as part of their research in ancient scripts. They also showed a surprising degree of respect for Gu Ernang by commissioning her to make only the most valuable inkstones and calling her by the most honorific names. So her professional name Ernang appeared first in writing in this book, Inkstone Chronicle or Yan Shi, a collection of inkstone encomiums or Ming, compiled by Lin Fuyun. Huang Ren was particularly fond of using Ernang of this name to refer to Gu. The older generation in the circle, Lin Zhi and Yu Dian, in turn preferred the high honorific of Gu Da Gu, or Lady Scholar, Nu Shi, or Madame Gu of Suzhou, woman Gu Shi. So comparing her to Ban Zhao, the only female historian in Chinese history. So this respect on the parts of the Fuzhou patrons cuts a striking contrast with the disdain held by the Suzhou patron Huang Zhongjian. We can then see that even among Gu's male patrons, there is a wide degree or spectrum of attitudes towards the artisan. And this divergence in itself suggests that the old attitude towards the artisan was breaking down slowly in the 18th century. Inkstone Chronicle is a gem, is a goldmine. It contains fascinating details about Gu Ernang's practice as a master inkstone carver, although there's absolutely no information on financial arrangements. We learned of, for example, a division of labor and a hierarchy of skills within the high-end trade of inkstone making. The commissioning process is rather consistent as the one we've seen in Suzhou. The patron or the client would bring the stone to the artisan, and together they decide on the best design treatment that is the most appropriate for the stone in accordance with that one-of-a-kind stone and all of the mineral features on the face. That's why I had asked you to take a note of especially that precious feature. And as I mentioned about this negotiation back and forth is always conducted face to face. Yu Dian, for example, procured an exquisite Duan stone in 1709 when he was sojourning in Suzhou and commissioned Gu Ernang to carve it. The stone, called Supreme Simplicity, was left almost in its natural state. This is not supreme simplicity, unfortunately, but it does bear Yu Dian's encomium on the back. So after, the reason why I want to talk about this example is because who touch which part of the inkstone is really important to our game here. So after Yu Dian composed this encomium for that specific inkstone, he asked a calligrapher friend of his by the name of He Zhao, who was arguably the most famous calligrapher in Suzhou at the time, to write it out on paper with his brush, and then he gave that piece of model to an expert carver of words whom He Zhao recommended himself, another stone carver in Suzhou. we, from this example, learn that the carving of words or inscriptions was a specialized skill that was entered by separate hands from the one who made the inkstone itself, at least in the high-end market. So another commission, this time made by Lin Zhi, suggests that there is a hierarchy of skills involved in the different steps of the making of the inkstone. So in 1700, Lin Zhi bought in a curio shop in Taohuawu in Suzhou an antique inkstone with inscriptions by the Yuan painter Zhang Mengfu, the Ming painter Wen Zhengming, and the seal and the Ming of the Ming collector Xiang Yuanbian. How likely do you think this is a genuine stone? It's kind of like finding in an estate sale a Picasso that had passed through the hands of Warhol and Jeff Koons. But Lin Zhi evidently believed that it was genuine. And even more shockingly, he decided to run to Gu's workshop, which is about 10 minutes from Taohuawu, and ask her to remake it because he found the water pool and the ink pool, basically the surface you use to grind ink, and also the hollow you use to store temporary ink was too small for his calligraphic brush. So the verb used for this procedure, opening the ink pool, or 开始, connoted a creative act of initiation, one that endowed the inkstone with authentic life force, just like the Buddha's ceremony of opening the eyes of the Buddha statue or Kaiyan. To a calligrapher, the ink pool, which is a smooth and ever so slightly concave surface, is the crux of an inkstone. Its degree of smoothness depends on the density and the porosity of the stone, as well as the slight degree of concavity, the overall size of the inkstone, and the size of the brush for which the inkstone is intended. So far from being a remedial task, enlarging the ink pool of an antique inkstone was such a delicate operation that it ranked at the top of the hierarchies of skills for an inkstone maker. So these two examples of commissioning suggest that Gu Ernang's Fuzhou patrons appreciated the most was her expert skill, especially in opening the ink pool. They reserved the most precious and expensive raw stones for her and did not ask her to carve the inscriptions. What they expected was a perfectly polished surface that could produce the smoothest and the most consistent ink. They valued her skillful hands, eyes, and mind. Neither her fame nor her female gender is of consequence in their decisions to entrust to her the most valuable stones. I would end this section on Gu Ernang's career as a master craftswoman with her own verbal description of her artistry as recorded by Suzhou writer Zhu Xiangxian. An inkstone is carved from a piece of rock. It would have to become round and lively, as well as fat and opulent, 圆活肥润, before the wonders of carving is made apparent. If the inkstone appears dull, dry, emaciated, and stiff, 矮板受硬, it is in fact the original face of the rock. Then what good did the carving do? These words highlight the transformative power of the artisan at work. Her artistry is the generative work of heaven's creation that bestows life force onto the stone. In this sense, carving an inkstone, carving stone, is the ultimate act of culture improving upon nature. Everything I have said about Gu up to this point was gleaned from textual sources, actually. I now tackle the tricky problem of the material archive, or the lack thereof, a profusion of inkstones in museum and private collections that bear Gu Ernang's signature marks. These marks come in a rather standard format verbally. The wording varied only very slightly, made by Gu Ernang of Suzhou, 无门Gu Ernang zhi, 无门Gu Ernang zao. You're looking at one example, the ink rubbing on the back of a pair of swallows and apricot inkstone in the Tianjin Museum in regular script. But these marks appear in a variety of scripts. Some are in relief, like this one, whereas others are in intaglio. This is really curious. If the very purpose of attaching a signature mark to a stone by an artisan or her studio is to allow buyers to identify the origins of her work, what good do signature marks do if there's no standard format? Even more curiously, buyers in the 18th century market, as in today, do not seem to care. Any inkstone with a made by Gu Ernang in Suzhou mark would command attention or fetch a much higher price. I wonder, what do we make of this phenomenon? So I can't give this part of the talk in China, they would come and kill me. Seriously. I got into feisty fights with them. The collectors who have just paid RMB 100,000 for Gu Ernang inkstone may not like to hear this, but I do not think that any inkstone bearing the Gu mark can be authenticated given our present state of knowledge. This is because none of the stones can be corroborated with the available textual sources which I have just introduced to you. There is no incontrovertible benchmark against which others can be compared and judged. This looks like it, that doesn't. But the proliferation of the Gu mark can in fact tell us something even more important than attribution, which is the highest business in connoisseurship. And that is, it documents the history, the social and cultural history of Gu Ernang's transformation from a real, full-bodied artisan into an abstract notion, a legend, in an increasingly impersonal and heated competitive marketplace. I want to borrow my colleague Lydia Liu's notion of a super sign to call this aspect of Gu Ernang becoming a legend, a super brand. In other words, Gu Ernang is kind of like an LV logo. It is not just an LV, the words or the brand branded in gigantic form on a $5,000, or is it more today, bag, which can be easily copied, but a cluster of other visual clues such as the brown leather trim or the printed plastic with various patterns, which is most ugly to me. So a super brand works by clustering or the repetition of a bunch of visual tropes, hallmarks, with or without a signature mark. The collector would recognize an inkstone to be Gu Ernang if it features one of these familiar tropes. So one of the ones that you're looking at is the pear, swallow, and apricot trope. And the world is full of this. Some of these stones might have Gu Ernang's signature mark, like this one. The gigantic words to the left, they're so disproportional as if the collector is blind. Others do not, actually. But no matter, the unmarked ones announce her authorship by association. I call it the artisan function instead of the author function. The collector can thank his good luck and a good eye. I spot a genuine but unsigned Gu Ernang. Only I am smart enough to recognize it and pay $10,000 for it while it's worth $200,000. So I want to run through two of these familiar visual tropes. The pear swallow, as I said, is one. It is a favorite subject in textile and needlework. The Yuan, the 11th century painter Trebor, was among the first to have painted the motif in a composition that is now preserved as a Yuan dynasty Ke tapestry to your left. The inkstone design followed this composition of a swallow swooping down from the sky and another one flying up from below, and their beak or mouth kind of meet romantically somewhere. And there's usually some branch or apricot flower in between. The most refined example of the pear swallow inkstone with a Gu Ernang signature mark is in the Tianjin Museum. It's a beautiful stone. An ink rubbing is on the right of the screen. The knife marks on the stone surface, especially on the left wing of the lower bird you're looking at, the left wing, left to us. You will see that these knife marks take the form of light and dainty slashes made by tapping the tip of a carving knife on the surface with measured force. And the dawn stone is much softer than the other two stones, so this is doable. It dawned on me that the slashes, evenly lined up in rows, resembled embroidery stitches. So you see the famous Gu style embroidery to the left, and an artist's rendition from the Shanghai Museum underneath. Could it be that the artisan who carved the swallows and apricot flowers was actually familiar with the refined stitching techniques of Suzhou embroidery? I would love to think so, but again, I have no proof. Another trope associated with the super brand of Gu Ernang is the dramatic phoenix. The color of these stones, as you can see, differ, but the compositional concept is remarkably consistent. The phoenix head is placed near the upper left corner of the stone, its neck twisted as the head turns to face the right. Ouch. To its left and right, the bird spread its two wings by literally draping it on the edges and side of the narrow edge of the inkstone, which in this case is only 2.6 cm wide. So, in other words, so the curves of the feathers are carried over from the front, through the side, and all the way to the back, so that the feathers are kind of cascading down to the edge of the inkstone. So, in physical shape and format, the phoenix trope is a radical departure from the pair swallows you have just seen, which essentially is an image that looks like a painting that is being executed on the back of the stone, the flat back surface. So the image is basically independent from the front, making it a decorative motif interchangeable with any other. But the phoenix, in contrast, is integral to the shape, design, and structure of the stone itself. Modern scholars of ceramics have called this treatment of an animal or a plant crossing from the outside surface of a vessel, like a bowl, to the inside, 过墙, or climbing over the wall. Literally what we want to do when we are frustrated. Jade carvers appear to be the instigators of climbed over dragons, which allowed references to antique jades while displaying the daring open work techniques. In the early Qing, only in the 17th century, this technique started to cross over from jade to other stone mediums, including inkstones, but also porcelain and inks. It's a uniquely 17th to 18th century phenomenon, roughly, if you are a Qing historian, roughly around Yongzheng's reign. And then in 20 years, it stopped. They stopped doing it. So it's really intriguing that this intermediate experiment somehow was not being carried over. So the novel presentation of the climbed over phoenix on inkstones essentially puts a premium on the artisan's ability to visualize the alignment of the feathers on the key transitional zone of the inkstone's upper edge or side, so that the feathers appear to wrap around the free surfaces of the front, back, and side naturally. In other words, the challenge is to conceptualize these sides simultaneously as connected or deathless surfaces and as constituting a three-dimensional object with material heftiness. So the conceptual craft is a fundamental breakthrough. No one before that time had made an inkstone that is this three-dimensional. There is no Ming or Song inkstone that has this carryover concept. By pushing towards three-dimensionality, the super brand of Gu Ernang was associated with one of the most original conceptual experiments in inkstone making. Her native city of Suzhou and the home of her patrons, Fuzhou, were connected by networks of formal and informal patronage with back and forth interactions and traveling among collectors, calligraphers, and artisans in different workshops and trade. So together, Fuzhou and Suzhou emerge as the creative hubs of inkstone making in early modern China. But even that quickly ended by the Qianlong reign. No one was doing these experiments. So I have presented very contradictory messages about Gu Ernang's gender. To her Fuzhou patrons, that she was a woman hardly mattered. What they valued was her superior skills and artistry. But to some other scholars, both her female gender and occupation marked her as their social inferior. So the coexistence of these opposite views, I would argue, is exactly what makes 18th century China so interesting. Gu Ernang's singular career not only demonstrates that attitudes towards the capacities of women were changing, but also that the scholar's traditional dominance over the craftsman has begun to loosen. There are many factors that led to this loosening, including, as we know, dwindling employment opportunities for scholars and the professionalization of the crafts itself. To Gu Ernang, who was a writer who completed a notation book about 40 years after Gu Ernang's death, the remarkable success of Gu Ernang and other artisans who rose to the top of their respective trades signal a reversal of fortune. A reversal of fortune between the scholar and the artisan. He wrote, recently, people who manage a trade 制业 and specialize in one vessel 工艺器 have gone very far in becoming known to the world, even attaining immortality. The verb choice of 知 connotes expert knowledge in a dedicated field. So if we can think of 治学 to dedicate oneself to scholarship, or 治国 to manage the country or the realm, the verb 治 has seldom been used to refer to an artisan, to a craft. This verb choice signals Gu Ernang's respect, himself a scholar, his respect for a new kind of artisan who distinguished themselves and left a mark in the world by honing the skills in a specialty craft. And most intriguing is the hint of contempt that Gu Ernang, himself a scholar and a famous jurist, showed for his own kind, for its scholars, and his regard for the professional artisan, whom he deemed to be far superior to those scholars who hold fast to their ignorance, sit bored on their thumbs without innovating, or died without ever winning a degree or post, or perish in oblivion. How pathetic. Gu Ernang said, look, you people who study for the exam and fail to capture even a Shengyuan degree, stop going there. Look how cool an artisan is. So his elevation of an artisan gets immortality and money before he died, unlike you. So his elevation of the artisan, like that of the Fuzhou patron of Gu Ernang, signals new intellectual priorities in judging the validity of knowledge and basically new social realities of the elevation of highly literate and skilled artisans who could have become scholars such as Chen Hongshou, but couldn't because of the Manchu's favoritism towards Manchu and Mongol officials. So we see a large number of highly educated men becoming carvers, seal makers, or doctors in the early Qing because of the changing political climate. But to have a woman is still rather unusual. So that's it. So far, I have given my historical analysis of Gu Ernang as a professional historian. Basically, admitting that I actually don't know anything. Because the method actually I was trained in, even in material culture studies, does not really allow me to get at some even very basic fundamentals about Gu Ernang's life and death and her career. But I have, a confession to make before I let you go. This painting of a woman washing an inkstone, which is an extremely rare example, that's why I put it in my book 3 times because it's extremely rare. It's the only one I can find. Depicting a woman, not a man, holding an inkstone. But it represents a puzzle to me I cannot solve. And the puzzle is she a scholar or an artisan? Or maybe a more accurate way of asking the question is, did the artist, the painters, Shih and Nan who are a pair of really famous Suzhou workshop artists, did the painters depict her as a scholar or an artisan? How are we supposed to know? What are the visual clues of an artisan? For the longest time, I saw this painting in Tianjin, and I just fell in love with it because it's so telling and rare. For the longest time, I had instinctively assumed her to be a scholar. And that habit of mine bothered me. What bothers me is the fact that as scholars, or as a scholar, let's not put words in your mouth, as a scholar, I tend to identify with historic scholars in my research. So even as I was researching women's history, my first book was on poets and female scholars. I tried to reconstruct their nianpu, their linear biographies, the friendship networks, the jiaoyou trend, which is all of the old philological tricks used to study male scholars. I celebrated the intellectual achievements of my female poets as if they were male scholars. And rah, how cool is that? They finally got to be men. But an artisan's career is fundamentally different from a scholar's. An artisan's life is more recursive than linear. Her skills are honed by repetition, just like a religious practice. She does not need to write books to attract notice, and that's why Gu Ernang was literate, but she did not need to write. Why do we assume that writing is superior to making? Her CV consists of the sum total of all the singular objects she has made for each individual patron. Instead of publish and perish, her anxiety is practice and perish. The knowledge useful to an artisan is specific and concrete. If your patron, your buyer likes your work, you want them to come back 10 years later and commission another inkstone. You want him to tell his friends, otherwise you and your family would starve to death. The knowledge useful to the scholar is abstract and generalizable, but the knowledge useful to an artisan, as I said, is specific and concrete. I can go on and on. But let me end by suggesting that unless we begin to recognize the intrinsic bias of our scholarly apparatus and assumptions, values, we can never come to know Gu Ernang, or any male artisan for that matter, without translating her into cherished images of ourselves. In other words, gender, in the final analysis, is less important than class when we try to understand how gender and material culture interact. It is far easier for us to be gender aware and to give women scholars their due in history than to give the artisan her due when we study material culture as scholars. Thank you.